Audiobooks and beyond.
The Last Sleep, narrated by Robert Wilson. Day 1. The day began like any other, with a groan at the sound of the alarm. Dr. Julian Croft, a neuroscientist who had dedicated his life to studying the intricacies of sleep, dragged himself out of bed, feeling as if he'd barely closed his eyes. He dismissed it as a simple restless night. Nothing to be concerned about. He arrived at the lab and found his colleague Sarah, a neuropharmacologist, staring blankly at a blinking cursor on her computer screen. Her shoulders were hunched, her hair was disheveled, and the usual spark in her eyes was gone. "Rough night?" he asked, his own voice sounding more brittle than he intended. Sarah didn't even look at him. "Couldn't turn it off," she muttered, a tremor in her voice. "My brain just kept going." Julian felt a sharp flicker of irritation at her lack of response. The office was quiet, but not in a peaceful way. It was a tense, brittle silence that seemed to get on his nerves. He watched as a coffee mug slipped from a colleague's hand and shattered on the floor. Instead of helping, Julian found himself annoyed that no one was cleaning up the mess, stepping around the broken ceramic with a vacant, unconcerned look. People bumped into each other in the hallways, and Julian had to bite back a scathing remark as one man shuffled past him, bumping his shoulder without an apology. He was simply in a bad mood, he told himself. That was all. By evening, Julian knew he needed a full night's rest. He ate a light meal, drank some chamomile tea, and lay down, confident that sleep would come. It didn't. He watched the clock's luminous hands tick by, each passing minute an act of torture. Day 2. Julian stared at the ceiling for hours. The silence in his apartment was suffocating. He felt a profound, unsettling stillness in his mind. Not a peaceful calm, but a hollow vacuum of thought. His brain, which usually buzzed with ideas and questions, was now just static. He got up feeling like a ghost, haunting his own body. At the lab, Julian found the atmosphere more strained. Sarah was there, but she was quieter, jumpier. She flinched when a lab door slammed shut and spilled coffee all over her notes, sighing in frustration before staring blankly at the dark stain. Julian felt his own patience wearing thin. He tried to focus on his work, but his thoughts were muddy, and a dull ache throbbed behind his eyes. He saw a man in a neighboring lab furiously scribbling on a whiteboard, muttering about how the numbers were all wrong and the math didn't want to make sense. Julian found himself getting into a brief, pointless argument with a colleague over the location of a box of beakers, his voice rising without him even realizing it. The world felt like it was moving just a beat too slow, and he was a beat too fast. He went to the cafeteria for a break and overheard a news report on a small television. A reporter with deep, bruised bags under his eyes was speaking haltingly about an unprecedented surge in highway accidents. "We are seeing multiple reports of accidents today. Stay off the freeway if you can avoid it," the reporter said, his voice cracking. Julian couldn't wait for the day to end so he could get home and get some real sleep. That night, Julian went through a desperate routine to try to coax sleep. He dimmed the lights to a soft glow, put on a playlist of tranquil soundscapes, and settled into a chair with a book. His eyes scanned the page, but his mind refused to process the words. He found himself rereading the same sentence over and over, his concentration slipping away like grains of sand. He turned off the music and tried to meditate, focusing on his breathing. He counted his breaths, but the numbers kept getting jumbled and he'd lose his place, starting over in a frustrated loop. He closed his eyes, and the darkness was not a comfort. It felt like a heavy velvet curtain that pressed in on him. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a brief, tall shadow behind him in the reflection of his television screen, but when he turned around, nothing was there. He told himself it was just a result of his own exhaustion, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. "If things keep up like this, I'm going to have to take some medicine. I have to sleep," he told himself. Day 3. The figure in the reflection was still there. It had been there all night. A tall, gaunt man, his face obscured by a hat pulled low. Julian didn't know how he could see it, but its presence was a constant, cold pressure on his mind. It wasn't moving, just standing there, unblinking. He turned on the lights, and the figure vanished, but he felt its presence linger. He realized he couldn't keep going like this. Still, the middle of the night, he walked to a nearby 24-hour pharmacy, his movements feeling disjointed and clumsy. The pharmacist, a young man with a twitch in his eye, simply stared at the wall as Julian spoke. "Sleeping pills," Julian said, his voice a hoarse whisper. The pharmacist, without a word, grabbed a box of over-the-counter sleep aids and slid it across the counter. Julian took a handful of pills as soon as he got home, a desperate gamble for just a few hours of rest. He lay down in bed, and his body felt heavy, his mind felt light. He felt himself sinking into a deep, peaceful sleep. But the sleep wasn't real. It was a suffocating, churning sea of nightmares while he was still awake. He saw the figure in the hat, but this time, it wasn't a static hallucination. It was moving, creeping closer, its eyes visible for the first time. The eyes were bottomless pits of shadow, with no life in them. He tried to run, but his legs were lead. He screamed, but no sound came out. He shook himself out of that stupor, his heart pounding, his body drenched in sweat. He looked in the mirror, and the man in the glass had eyes that were bottomless pits of shadow, with no life in them. He didn't know what was real anymore. The world outside his lab was unraveling. The news channels were in a frenzy. The term fatal familial insomnia was being thrown around, but this was different. It wasn't a rare genetic disorder. It was a plague. Traffic lights were failing, power grids were unstable, and disturbing reports surfaced about people becoming violent for no reason. One television report showed a man screaming and trying to claw his way through the glass of his window, convinced that his reflection was trying to get in. Sarah's demeanor had changed from manic fear to a strange, childlike wonder. She was doodling on her notepad, drawing a figure that looked unnervingly similar to the one Julian had seen. It was a distorted version of a man, with grotesquely large eyes that were bottomless pits of shadow. When he asked her about it, she just smiled. "Don't worry," she said, "he's waiting for me to be ready." Julian felt his mind begin to slip. He was losing his grip on reality. The line between what was real and what was a product of his sleep-deprived mind was blurring. That night, he knew a pharmacy trip wouldn't help. The pills had only made the hallucinations stronger. His mind felt like a chaotic buzz. He sat in front of his computer, the blue light a harsh, familiar enemy. He furiously typed a search into a browser. How long can a person go without sleep? The top result was from a medical journal he knew well. The article documented the record of a teenager who had gone 11 days, 25 minutes. He was lucid for the first few days, but then descended into a state of paranoia and severe hallucinations, believing that people were out to get him. The article said the teen recovered fully. Julian's mind latched onto the phrase "recovered fully." He was a scientist, not a madman. He could endure this. But as he scrolled, he saw a comment thread below the article, filled with bizarre, unhinged ramblings about shared hallucinations and shadows in the corner. "They're here now," one person had written. "They don't want us to sleep. They're going to use us for their own purposes." Julian sat back in his chair and closed his eyes, desperately hoping to find some sleep. Day 4. The eyes were gone when he looked again, but he couldn't forget them. He got up from the chair as the sunlight pierced his apartment, a crick in his neck and a gnawing dread in his stomach. The simple act of moving felt like a monumental effort. He went to the kitchen and tried to make coffee, but his hands shook so badly that he spilled the grounds and then the water, staring blankly at the dark, wet mess as if it were a foreign language. He turned and stumbled toward the bathroom. He stepped into the shower, letting the cold spray sting his skin. He scrubbed his body with soap, the scent of lavender a sharp, unfamiliar smell. He stepped out and dried himself with a towel, But as he was about to get dressed, he looked down at his arm. It felt sticky. He sniffed at it. There was no scent of soap. Had he just imagined the shower? He didn't know. He got back in, turned the water to a punishing cold, and repeated the process, a blank, panicked stare on his face as he watched the water swirl down the drain. He couldn't remember a thing. He was now convinced that the figure was a shared hallucination. When he spoke to other colleagues, they all described seeing something similar, a tall, thin man with eyes that were like bottomless pits of shadow. They called them the Sleepless. When he finally made it to work, the hallways were eerily empty. Most people were taking sick days, desperate for rest. He and Sarah were two of the few still working. He told her about his hallucinations and the article he read. Julian was convinced he could find a cure. He was a neuroscientist, and he knew the brain better than anyone. He just needed more time. But with each passing hour, his mind felt like it was deteriorating, crumbling into dust. His hands shook uncontrollably, and he found himself staring into space for long periods, unable to recall what he was doing. He started to see the Sleepless in every corner, on the floor, on the ceiling. They were silent, unblinking, and they seemed to draw closer when he wasn't looking directly at them. When he got home that evening, the effort of the day had left him a shell of a man. His apartment, which had once been a refuge, felt alien. He walked to the kitchen, the simple task of making dinner a puzzle his brain couldn't solve. He pulled a carrot from the crisper drawer, his hands fumbling with the knife. The blade felt impossibly heavy and slick. He tried to slice the carrot, but his hands were too uncoordinated. The knife slipped, and he stared at the red line blooming on his index finger. He felt no pain, only a detached curiosity as the blood welled up, a vibrant red against his pale skin. He simply stood there, watching the blood drip onto the counter, unable to remember what he was supposed to be doing. He finally wrapped the wound in a paper towel, a mindless action, and threw the carrot in the trash. He gave up on dinner and stumbled to his couch, the darkness a welcome comfort that was no longer a comfort. Day 5. Julian got up from the couch where his body had collapsed the night before, his body aching and his clothes twisted into a damp, uncomfortable mess. He tried to stand, but his legs buckled, and he had to brace himself against the coffee table. The simple act of putting one foot in front of the other felt like navigating a treacherous landscape. The world was a blur, the sounds of his apartment a chaotic symphony of buzzing and humming. He went to the kitchen and stared blankly into the refrigerator, the vibrant colors of the food blurring into a single, overwhelming mess. He reached for a carton of milk, but his hand misjudged the distance, knocking it to the floor. The carton burst, and the milk spread across the floor like a white, churning sea. He stared at it, unable to process what had happened. He looked down at his clothes and realized he was still in the clothes he had worn the day before. He tried to remember if he had showered. He couldn't. He staggered to his bedroom, his mind a complete blank. When Julian finally stumbled into the lab, Sarah was already there. She looked even worse than he did, her eyes sunken and bloodshot. They sat in a tense, shared silence until Sarah turned on a small television they kept in the corner for news breaks. The broadcast was a live global report, but it was just as unhinged as the comments Julian had seen online. A reporter, who looked like she was about to collapse, spoke in a trembling voice about mass societal collapse. She showed videos of cars stopped in the middle of highways, their drivers staring blankly ahead. She spoke of power plants going offline and air traffic control centers descending into chaos. The anchor's voice cracked as she announced that an entire flight had gone missing, the last transmission from the pilot being a panicked, nonsensical babble about the passengers in the aisles. The video feed cut to a live shot of a bustling city center where people were no longer walking but simply wandering, their faces slack and their movements slow and uncoordinated. It was no longer a personal battle, it was a plague, and it was consuming the world. The Sleepless were everywhere. Julian no longer saw them as hallucinations, he saw them as real. He was convinced they were a physical manifestation of the mental deterioration from the lack of sleep. Their presence was a constant, chilling hum in his mind. He heard the faint sound of a high-pitched giggle behind him. He spun around, but no one was there. A beaker on the floor shattered and the light on his computer screen flickered. He turned to Sarah, and she just smiled and pointed at the empty corner of the room. "He did it," she whispered, her voice full of pride. He saw the sleepless now. He saw them for what they were. They weren't a delusion. They were real, and they were here. He saw one standing right in front of him. He tried to push it, but his hand went straight through it. It was like pushing through cold air. They were like ghosts. But they were moving things. They were making noises. They were making their presence known. With the news report serving as a grim validation of their fears, Julian and Sarah decided they couldn't risk leaving the lab. The outside world was a collapsing death trap, and their only hope was to find a cure. They scoured the lab for food, a cache of protein bars and bottled water, enough to last a few days. They worked in a frantic, desperate rhythm, trying to reverse engineer the brain's sleep cycle. Julian's mind was a chaotic buzz, a constant stream of jumbled equations and chemical compounds. He'd start a calculation, forget the purpose of it, and then start over, a blank, panicked look on his face as he watched the numbers swirl. Sarah, meanwhile, had descended into a state of quiet, manic laughter, occasionally sketching the figures on her notepad. The lab, once a place of scientific order, had become a prison of their own making. Day 6. The world was gone. The city outside was quiet, eerily quiet. There were no cars, no sirens, no helicopters. Only the hum of the emergency power generator that was keeping the lab alive. Sarah was now completely gone. She sat in a corner, talking to the sleepless, telling them stories, asking them questions. Julian ignored her. He was now on his final, desperate attempt at a cure. He had to reverse the brain's deterioration. He had to restore the sleep cycle. He knew that the only way to save humanity was to find a cure for this plague, but he was running out of time. His mind was no longer a simple buzz. It was a cacophony of white noise and fragmented memories. He looked at his hands and couldn't remember what they were for. He stared at a beaker of fluid, his brain unable to identify the clear liquid. He had to think, he told himself, but the very act of thinking was now impossible. It felt like trying to grab smoke with his bare hands. He saw the sleepless in his periphery, and they seemed to multiply, their numbers growing as his mind unraveled. They were a part of him now, born from his own failing mind. Day 7. With the sun a distant memory for the day, Julian, slumped over on his chair, realized in a haze, a desperate need for the bathroom was overwhelming his senses. He stumbled out of the lab, his legs unsteady, and pushed open a door. He went inside, and a wave of relief washed over him as he began to relieve himself. The sound of liquid hitting something soft, something solid, was muffled, strange. He finished and looked up, his eyes widening in horror. He wasn't in a bathroom. He was in a supply closet, and he had just urinated all over the lab coats hanging inside. A wave of shame and panic washed over him, a brief, terrifying return to sanity. The sleepless were everywhere, their presence more pronounced than ever before. He shook his head, and his mind returned to the chaotic buzz. He spent the night in a feverish, manic blur, his movements no longer his own. It was a terrifying, autonomous dance of hands and lab equipment. He didn't think, he simply did. His hands, guided by some deep subconscious knowledge, mixed and measured, pouring one compound into another with a terrifying precision he no longer possessed in his conscious mind. He wasn't following a formula. He was following the chaotic hum in his head, the whispers of the sleepless that had taken root in his mind. He worked with a blank, panicked stare on his face, his body moving on its own, a puppet on a string. He was a scientist without a mind, a body without a soul. He worked throughout the night, using the inputs he had put into the computer, hoping that the numbers that didn't make sense to him now would create the formula for the serum. The formula was a beautiful, elegant equation, a masterpiece of his own decaying mind. This had to be the cure. He was convinced. He knew he had to administer it to Sarah. He approached her, the syringe in his hand trembling so violently that he nearly dropped it. The sleepless around them seemed to lean in, watching their silent presence a crushing weight. He found a good spot on her arm and pressed the needle in. A low, guttural moan escaped his lips as he pushed the plunger, the act feeling less like a scientific procedure and more like a monstrous sacrifice. He waited. Nothing happened. He stared at her, a profound sense of failure and dread washing over him. Then, her eyes fluttered, and her eyelids closed in a calm, peaceful manner. Julian felt a surge of relief. He had done it. She was finally sleeping. The sleepless were gone. The lab was silent. The clock on the wall jumped past midnight, and a lucid thought, a spark of pure clarity, pierced Julian's mind. He had been awake for over 7 days. He looked at Sarah, her body still and peaceful on the cold concrete floor of the lab. He watched the gentle rise and fall of her chest, a reassuring rhythm in the silent lab. He imagined what it would be like to lie down, to close his eyes, and finally, mercifully sleep. A wave of exhaustion so profound it felt like a physical weight pressed down on him, and he smiled. Soon, he thought, soon he would feel that peace. He just had to wait for more of the serum to be produced. He knelt beside her, his hand trembling as he reached for her wrist. His fingers brushed her skin. It was cold, too cold. He fumbled for a pulse, pressing his thumb into her wrist, then her neck. Nothing. No shallow rise and fall of her chest. No breath on her lips. She wasn't sleeping. She was dead. The cure had failed. His mind, for a brief, terrifying second, was lucid. He had just murdered his colleague. The formula he had created was not a cure for the plague. It was a poison. He looked at the window, and the city was still silent. He was the one who was supposed to be the hero, but there was no cure. There was no hero. There was only the madness. He stared at Sarah's body, his hands trembling. There was no escape. He knew his body was at its limit. The hallucinations were no longer a symptom of his condition. They were his companions, a constant reminder of his fate. He had nowhere to go, no one to save, and the clock was ticking, counting down the hours until his own mind and body would fail him forever. He wasn't a living person anymore. The horror wasn't something that was coming for him. The horror was already there, living inside of him, and he knew it would consume him completely, leaving behind nothing but the cold, endless silence.